Welcome back to our APES flipped classroom. And today we're talking about the concept called the theory of island biogeography. So it's important to recognize that when we talk about this theory of island biogeography, we're not really necessarily talking about true islands, but we are talking about areas that for one reason or another are isolated from the rest of their habitat. So this might be a true island in a body of water, but more often when we talk about them, we're actually talking about habitat islands. So a park, whether that's Central Park in New York City, a national park, a wildlife refuge. So it's an area that is surrounded by human development, but which is still wild and natural. So there's Central Park as an example. So there's kind of two basic observations that we can make about island biogeography, and we're going to go into detail about why these are. But the first one is that larger islands are going to support more total species. The bigger the island is, the greater its ecosystem diversity is going to be. And that greater ecosystem diversity is going to bring more food, more habitat resources, more niches or roles that organisms can play in the ecosystem, a greater variety of food sources, more potential nesting and shelter opportunities. And then in addition to larger islands supporting more total species, islands that are closer to a quote mainland end quote are going to support more species. So whether again we're talking about a true island in a body of water or whether we're talking about an isolated habitat because of human development, the closer it is to other areas of habitat, the easier it's going to be for those colonizing organisms to get to that island. And that's going to result in more genetic diversity in the population, which is going to result in more species. So we have these two graphs. So the larger it is, the more species there are going to be, and the farther from the mainland it is, the fewer species there are going to be. So we have two different implications here. All right, so let's kind of delve into that larger islands concept. So when we have these larger islands, we're going to have higher ecosystem diversity. We're going to have more available niches. So if we look at the Galapagos Islands, which are one of the classic examples when we talk about evolution and also when we talk about speciation, the Galapagos Islands are true islands. They're not habitat islands in the sense of development, but actual true islands. And on these islands, which are relatively large, we have different zones. So there's an arid zone, a sandy zone that's down by the ocean. And as you move up through the islands, increasing elevation, you get different vegetation, and therefore you get different animal species as well. There's a lot of different food sources available, which means that it can support a larger population, which will then be more genetically diverse, more resistant to those environmental disturbances. And it's going to have a lower extinction rate. So the island size, the larger it is, the higher the species richness is going to be. So here's an example. This is actually from surveys of the West Indies Islands. And so you can see that as the islands get larger, then we increase the total number of reptilian and amphibian species on the island. Okay, so the other major factor is the distance to the mainland. The closer to the mainland the island is, the higher the species richness is going to be. This is simply because it's easier for species to migrate to the island from the mainland. If we're talking about a true island, then we're talking about being able to swim or fly. If we're talking about two different habitats that are separated by human development or by roads, then we're talking about the ability to transition safely through that human-occupied space. If it's closer, you're going to have continual migration of individuals to that island habitat. That migration is going to bring in genetic diversity. It's going to increase the population size. So the closer we are, the easier that migration is going to be. Of course, if you have a series of islands, there's also going to be migration between the islands, but there's going to be less migration between the more distant islands and the mainland than between the individual islands. And so you can see in our image here that we have, as we get farther from the mainland, we have fewer species. On the mainland, we have 3 species, and on island A, we have 3 species. But by the time we get to B, we only have 2, and by the time we get to C, we have only 1. So it definitely has an impact on that species richness. So we have this inverse relationship. The closer it is, the higher the species richness. The farther away it is, the lower the species richness. And that comes back to that graphic that we talked about on the first page. Okay, now islands, whether they are true islands or whether they are habitat islands, are prime for evolution, particularly when we're talking about true islands. They have limited space, they have limited resource, which means that there's going to be more pressure on species to adapt to these narrower niches. If we come back to those habitat zones in the Galapagos, we can see that we have very unique zones here. And one of the ways that animals get away from the pressure of having to share a resource is by resource partitioning. And one of the ways that we can do resource partitioning is when a species evolves, it creates new and different species that use those different resources and reduce competition. So we keep coming back to the Galapagos. This is where Darwin did his studies that led to his theory of evolution. And there's a reason for that, because there was rapid and significant evolution among the Galapagos finches. Their beaks evolved to fit the variety of the different food sources on the island. So we know that they all originated from one common ancestor from the South American mainland that either flew over or was blown over. But we can see that since then, they have evolved to have tree-dwelling finches and ground-dwelling finches. And the tree-dwelling finches and the ground-dwelling finches eat different things. Most of the tree-dwelling finches are insect eaters. There is one, it's called a vegetarian finch. And you can see that there are substantial differences in head shape and in beak shape. And that's because by eating different foods, by living in different spaces, they have managed resource partitioning. That single colonizing species from the South American mainland evolved to all those different species to adapt to the conditions on the island. All right, so here's your practice FRQ. I'd like you to describe the processes of colonizing an island habitat. And I want you to describe how the island's distance from the mainland influences the number of species that will colonize that island habitat. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. Look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow.